Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the Rey Lopez, beginning with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 begins the Roy, a6 is the Morphy defense. We're going to have bishop a4, knight f6, castles kingside, bishop e7, beginning the closed variation, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castles kingside, threatening to play the Marshal. And of course, we have to play an anti-Marshal here, because if we allow the Marshal has almost been analyzed to a forced perpetual at this point, and whenever white tries to avoid it, white ends up being worse. So we have to play some kind of anti-Marshal here, and the focus of this video is going to be this particular anti-Marshal system. It's going to be this move pawn to d4. So anyways, if you like content like this, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. Now, pawn to d4, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to be as popular a choice as far as anti-Marshal goes is any of the other anti-Marshal systems. It doesn't seem to be as popular as the move a4 or the move h3. You know, the h3 move is the so-called ambidextrous system trying to get back into the main line. But there doesn't appear to be a great reason for its unpopularity. d4 seems like a completely reasonable way for white to play for some sort of advantage. An interesting note to d4 is also an offer of a transposition. We can transpose into a main line of the Rey Lopez. After d4, d6, which has actually happened in several games, it is very possible for white to just play c3 and transpose into some kind of main line. There was this game Gary versus Carlsen played in 2015 that continued with bishop to g4. And of course, this is one of the reasons that I guess some people don't want to play d4, because maybe they don't have this bishop g4 thing in their repertoire. But even going back to the 1950s and 60s, playing c3 and d4 without the move pawn to h3 and allowing this pin was always considered perfectly acceptable. So we have this game like bishop e3, ed4, cd4, knight a5, bishop c2, knight c4, bishop c1, c5, b3, knight back to b6, knight on b to d2, and eventually white will kick that bishop back with pawn to h3, for example, rook to c8, bishop to b2, knight fd7, queen b1, g6, and now finally h3, and black either needs to exchange the bishop or, in this case, he needs to either exchange the bishop or lose it. So here, white, just kind of clearly has some sort of slight edge after the move pawn to h3, but in general, white has a slight edge in these positions. Playing the Rey Lopez, allowing bishop g4, this, like I said, it dates back all the way to the 1960s. This is a perfectly acceptable way to play chess with the white pieces. So, going back, another option that people have after d4 is, again, d6, c3, and they can kind of transpose directly into the main line. They can play knight a5. But the weird thing is after, like, say, knight a5, bishop to c2, if they play c5, if they're not going to play bishop to g4, white can actually get an advantage by having omitted the move pawn to h3. So you can continue with something like, say, knight on b to d2, rook e8, knight f1, bishop f8, bishop g5, g6, knight e3 should be advantage white, and it should actually be better than the main line of the Rey Lopez, because you've managed to get sort of the same position, but you've omitted the move pawn on h2 to h3. This was actually played between Garry Kasparov and Rizmelka, played back in 1993, and of course Garry Kasparov ended up with an advantage here with white, and of course he did go on to win. So, going back, d4, what if you don't want to transpose into the main line with black, or what if your opponent doesn't want to transpose into the main line? What's the main reason that people play d4 in this type of position? Well, of course, it's what happens after they take the pawn. So, of course, the first question is, what if they take the pawn with the pawn, right? E takes d4. And this is one of those rare instances where e takes d4 is actually not the correct move. General principle usually tells us that it's better to take the central pawn break with a pawn as opposed to a knight, because, as I've stated in previous videos, we don't want to end up with a queen that ends up on the d4 square that can't be easily kicked away by a knight, and we also don't want to lose control of the e5 square. So it's helpful usually to have a knight posted on c6 in a lot of e4, e5 positions. So like in the Scotch opening and a lot of other openings when people play d4 with white, we're supposed to take with the pawn. Here, we're not supposed to take with the pawn, which is weird, especially considering if you look at it tactically, you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, well, if pawn takes pawn, can't I just play knight takes pawn? Or, more to the point, can white not just play knight takes pawn? And, of course, white can't. If knight takes d4, black would win the game on the spot with a cute little trap known as the Noah's Ark trap. Pause the video and see if you can find it. It would go knight takes d4, really simple, queen d4, c5 hitting the queen, and the threat is pawn to c4. And of course, we don't have a counterattack with our queen. Like, we don't have queen d5 because the knight on f6 is holding the d5 square. So when we move the queen away, we're just going to have c4, and the bishop on b3 is trapped, and black will be up a whole piece. So this seems to make you think maybe e takes d4, am I just winning a pawn? And of course, the answer to that is no, because the intended move is just pawn to e5. And of course, we have a lot of thrust behind this move. We've got the rook, we've got the knight, we've got everything there. And then after the knight goes back to e8, apparently it's just major advantage white. White has huge, huge, huge attacking chances after the sacrificial continuation pawn to c3. So, for example, it could continue dc3, knight c3, knight a5, and we're actually following a game here. We're following Vysochin versus Sinel, played in the Ukraine back in 2013. And that game continued bishop to c2, pawn to c6, queen to d3, pawn to g6, bishop h6, and it was already just impossible to even try to save the exchange. So black played this move, pawn to d5, just to try to do something. And of course that allows bishop takes f8, but he took first with en passant takes, and then played rook d1, knight c4, knight e4, and he didn't give away his dark scored bishop so easily. And queen c3, f6, and then finally bishop takes f8, and of course he has a huge massive advantage here with the white pieces, and he went on to win. The whole thing is, it's really hard to defend at this point because you just have zero development. It's not clear how you activate your queenside, etc. If, for example, knight g7, just knight e4, knight to c4, bishop b3, c5, and we could do something like bishop c4, bc4, and not queen c4, because we don't really care about the material. What we care about is the dark squares. Queen c3, basically the threat is knight f6. And this is just nearly impossible to defend. For example, bishop b7, we could just check, takes, the knight has to move, and then of course we can just take, knight e5. Huge, huge, huge advantage for white. So this is just decisive advantage white all day long. But that is, like, generally speaking, kind of the problem with e takes d4, is e5 is going to come and white's going to have a huge advantage. So black is supposed to play knight takes d4. That's supposed to be the consensus theory here. And then white actually has a couple of options for moves here. Of course, the main move is just knight takes d4. And this is my favorite move. And actually, the game that I saw that inspired me to play this game is the game that I'm going to be following here in a second. And that game was Ivanchuk versus Lev Aronian. Highly interesting. The other possibility is bishop takes f7, which is really entertaining, and it's supposed to be okay for white. Like bishop takes f7, rook takes f7, knight takes e5. Of course, the point being the rook on f7 is hanging, the knight on d4 is hanging. Rook f8 got played, and we have queen takes d4, and super, super interesting position. And it's just really unclear. I'm not exactly sure what's going on here, but it's a super unclear position, super interesting, and it's definitely one way to go. But again, I was more inspired by this other continuation. Instead of bishop takes f7, I was kind of inspired by this continuation. Knight d4, e takes d4, e5. This continuation, I think, is more interesting. This was Ivanchuk versus Aronian, played in Linares back in 2008. And Ivanchuk should have won this game. And I often wonder if, like, the result of this game stopped people from playing this line, which I think is absolutely insane. Because if you look at the game, white just had a huge advantage for the vast majority of the game and just managed to blunder a piece down the road. And, honestly, it's nothing to do with the opening. So knight to e8 got played, queen d4, and then here's the whole point is, if they play a move like c5 here, going for this Noah's Ark trap, you have just a simple reply. You can just play queen to e4, and they have to spend a move moving their rook. And then when they spend a move moving their rook, you have a move to safeguard your bishop with either c4 or c3. Of course, my personal favorite was always c4 because I'm a little bit more aggressive, and I always loved the idea of meeting something like d takes c4 with bishop c2. So I always find ideas like that very entertaining, where I just choose not to take the pawn, and I just choose to continue with my aggressive attacking plans. So this is the reason why c5 maybe not so good. Maybe bishop b7 is a little bit better. And then in this game we had c4. Again, we're following the Ivanchuk versus Aronian game. bc4, queen c4, d5 takes, queen to g4. And white just has better attacking chances here. White just has some sort of advantage here. And it's actually very clear. So that game continued knight b5, knight c3, knight takes c3, bc3. And then we have bishop to d6, bishop f4, queen f6, bishop d6, cd6, and again, white never really let go of his advantage. Ivanchuk still has an advantage here. Rook a d1, rook a d8, queen to b4, still having an advantage, still targeting material, targeting the bishop on b7, targeting the pawn on d6, bishop to b7, bishop a8, rook e3, g6, queen b6, queen g5, rook g3, queen b5, still playing very well. Rook d6 takes, queen takes, pawn to a5. Now, of course, the back rank back here makes me a little nervous as a player. I'm always a little nervous, like, okay, when you have a weak back rank and you're conducting maneuvers, it's just like you feel like, okay, if as soon as I can clear this back rank, I know I have an advantage because I have this passed c pawn. It's an extra pawn, and I have to be better. But Ivanchuk is in kind of the uncomfortable situation of never quite having time to clear that back rank, which is okay. He still has an advantage. He plays queen f4, which prevents the pawn to a4 move, which would have, put some very awkward pressure on his bishop. And then bishop to d5 gets played, rook g5 gets played, f5 gets played, queen e5 gets played, which is supposed to be like somewhere between major to decisive advantage white already. Just queen e5 is just a phenomenal move. And then we have rook to d8, and now we have this question mark move, and of course it comes from just how we're taught as players coming up. Ivanchuk plays this move pawn to h4, just wanting to clear that back rank so bad, because once he knows once he clears the back rank, he has an extra pawn. So the instinct is really just to play pawn to h4. He had a completely winning position if he just kept kind of walking on that razor's edge and played a move like queen takes f5. His position is just absolutely, utterly decisive here. Just queen f5. The point is, the threat is bishop d5 check. And, after bishop d5 check, rook d5, queen d5, queen d5, rook, everything goes. So all the pieces go. It's really hard to defend against this. So queen f5 just would have been, game, set, match. That's the end of it. Instead, he plays h4, and he still had a huge advantage. After h4, we had a4, bishop to c2, queen back to b8. We had queen takes f5, which, again, absolutely the correct move. Bishop takes a2, bishop takes a4, bishop back to f7, h5, queen b6, hg6, hg6, queen f4, rook c8, queen b4, again correct. And now we have this move. Well, actually, queen b4 was the correct move. The move that he played here was this blunder. He played rook g3. Okay, now pause the video, see if you can see why this move is a blunder. And the reason rook g3 is a blunder, even though, again, it follows instincts, like you want to anchor your pieces. So rook g3 is an anchoring move. The problem is the bishop on a4 is not anchored, so this allowed the move rook to c4, which of course forks the queen and the bishop. And then after queen h6, rook takes bishop. Now black is up a piece. Interestingly enough, probably white still could have, held a draw here. White still has a good position because black's king is so loose, but white just lost a whole piece, and then he ended up to go on to lose the game. So this was Ivanchuk Aronian, played in Linares back in 2008, but of course he should have played, as previously stated, he should have played the move queen to b4, and then after queen to b4 we have queen to d8, rook to c5, and it's just decisive advantage white. White's up 2 clean pawns. Black's king is unsafe. White's king is very safe. Material is going to have to come off the board here, sooner rather than later, and that's just going to be it. That's just going to be the game. So that's kind of why when I look at these lines, like beginning with e takes d4, e5, knight e8, queen d4, bishop b7, c4, bc4, queen c4, I think really this needs to be advantage white, and this is something that I feel like I'm okay with having this in my repertoire, and I've actually played this position several times myself with the white pieces and gotten an advantage. So I feel like this is something that is a very reasonable try as an anti-Marshal system. I think if you want to play d4, go ahead and play d4. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.